The dust was a living thing. It coated her skin, a second, grittier layer that tasted of grit and finality. It filled her throat until her own breath felt foreign, borrowed from the parched land itself. They had tied her to the hitching post in the center of what passed for a town square, a sun-blasted patch of earth pounded flat by hooves and boots. The rope was coarse, biting into the flesh of her wrists, but she had stopped feeling the bite hours ago. Sensation was a luxury, a conversation with the world she could no longer afford. She kept her eyes fixed on a loose board on the porch of the general store across the way. It was a dark, splintered line against the bleached gray wood. That board was her world. It did not judge. It did not whisper. It did not spit tobacco juice that landed inches from her bare feet. If she focused on the board, she could retreat to a place deep inside herself, a small, quiet room with no windows and no doors, where the heat and the flies and the murmuring voices of the men who gathered to watch could not reach. She had been here since sunup. The sun, a merciless white eye in a bleached blue sky, had crawled its way to the peak of its journey and was now beginning its slow, condescending descent. Shadows, once huddled and small beneath wagons and barrels, stretched now like long skeletal fingers across the square. Her shadow stretched with them, a distorted, broken shape tethered to a post. A man named Brand, who smelled of cheap whiskey and self-satisfaction, had put her here. He had bought her, he'd said, part of a debt settled with a desperate farmer farther east. He had paraded her through 3 settlements, his unlucky penny. He called her, a woman whose silence was her only currency. Now, his luck had apparently run thin and she was baggage. $5. He boomed to the small, shifting crowd of onlookers. His voice was too big for the quiet despair of the afternoon. $5 for a strong back and a quiet mouth. Knows her chores. No one moved. A few men chuckled. A woman, clutching a basket of mending, looked at her for a moment with something that might have been pity, before her husband tugged her arm and pulled her away. Pity was dangerous. It was a crack in the wall of her inner room, and she could not allow it. She pressed her cheek against the rough wood of the post, the splinters a dull, welcome pain. The crowd was a beast with many heads and a single, sluggish mind. It shuffled its feet, coughed. It murmured judgments that the wind tore apart before they could fully form. They looked at her like a piece of livestock, gauging the strength in her thin frame, the years left in her. They saw ragged clothes, matted hair, the vacancy in her eyes. They saw an object, stripped of story and of name. She had forgotten her own name long ago. It was a stone she'd let sink to the bottom of a deep, murky river. It was safer there. Brand grew impatient. He spat a brown stream of tobacco near her feet. Fine. $3. A bargain, you fools. She don't eat much. Thin as a fence rail, but she's sturdy. Silence answered him. The sun kept falling. The shadows grew bolder. The crowd began to thin, drifting away like dust motes in a sunbeam, their curiosity sated, their own meager lives calling them home. Soon, it was just her, Brand, and a few lingering idlers propped against the mercantile, and one other. He had been there for some time, standing near the water trough, half hidden by the long shadow of the livery stable. He was separate from the crowd, a still point in the shifting heat. He wore a long, worn duster the color of the road, and a hat that shadowed his face. He hadn't spoken, hadn't moved. He just watched. She had felt his gaze different from the others. It wasn't probing or leering. It was heavy. It was a gaze that seemed to measure not her worth, but the weight of the air around her. For the first time that day, she lifted her head from the post and looked at him. She couldn't see his eyes, only the dark space beneath the brim of his hat. He carried whole winters in his posture, a stillness born of loss. He looked like a man who knew the anatomy of silence. Brand saw him too. His desperation soured into a sneer. What about you, friend? You look like a man who could use a helping hand. $2. My final offer. Or I leave her for the coyotes. The man at the trough did not move for a long moment. The world seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind died down. Then, slowly, he pushed himself away from the wall. He walked not toward Brand, but toward the post. His boots made no sound in the thick dust. He stopped a few feet from her. He still did not look at her, not directly. His attention was on the frayed ropes that bound her wrists. He carried the scent of pine and cold iron. He reached into his duster, his movements slow, deliberate. He pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. Without looking at Brand, he tossed it onto the ground between them. It landed with a soft, metallic clink. "I'll take her," he said. His voice was low, and sounded like it came from under floorboards, unused and resonant with hollow space. It wasn't a bargain. It was a statement. Brand's eyes, small and greedy, darted to the pouch. He stooped to snatch it, his practiced fingers quickly assessing its weight. A flicker of surprise, then satisfaction, crossed his face. He looked from the pouch to the silent man, then to her, a dismissive smirk playing on his lips. "Your funeral, friend. She's bad luck." The man ignored him. Brand shrugged, spat one last time, and turned, swaggering toward the saloon as if he had won something. The remaining onlookers, their small drama concluded, dispersed into the deepening twilight. They were alone. The square was empty, awash in the bruised colors of dusk. The man stood, unmoving, for a full minute. She didn't know what to expect. She braced herself, lowering her head again, retreating back to her windowless room. Then she heard the faint click of a knife opening. He stepped closer. She flinched, a small, involuntary tremor. He stopped. He waited. He held his hand out, palm up, showing her the plain, wooden handle of a small pocket knife. It was a gesture of profound, startling gentleness. It was not a threat. It was a tool. After a moment, she stilled. He moved forward again, his touch surprisingly light as he worked the blade behind the ropes at her wrist. He was careful not to let the steel touch her skin. The fibers gave way with a soft, sighing sound. One wrist came free, then the other. She didn't move. Her hands remained in front of her, frozen in the shape of their bondage. Blood, thick and sluggish, began to creep back into her fingers, bringing with it a wave of pins and needles that was its own kind of pain. She curled her hands into fists, her knuckles turning white. The man stepped back, giving her space. He folded the knife and slipped it back into his pocket. He did not speak. He did not offer a hand. He simply waited, a dark, patient shape against the fading light. He was letting the choice be hers, the choice to stay or to run, the choice to stand up. Slowly, unsteadily, she pushed herself away from the post. Her legs were cramped and weak. She staggered, and her hand flew out to steady herself against the rough wood that had been her prison. For a moment, the world tilted, a blur of purple sky and brown earth. He turned and started walking. He didn't look back to see if she was following. The assumption was an anchor, a quiet command more powerful than any rope. Her bare feet scuffed in the deep dust as she took the first step, then another, trailing him out of the dead square and into the vast open silence of the plains. The journey was a silent pilgrimage. He walked a few paces ahead, his stride long and even, eating up the ground. He never hurried her. When she stumbled on a loose stone, the sound of its skittering in the twilight was deafening. He would pause, his head cocked as if listening, but he would not turn around. He would only resume his pace when he heard the soft fall of her feet behind him again. The landscape was a creature of shadow and bone. The plains rolled out in every direction, immense and indifferent, under a sky littered with a spray of cold, distant stars. The wind whispered through the dry grasses, a lonely, ceaseless sound. It tugged at her thin dress and tangled in her hair. Dust lifted behind them like ghosts of the people they might have been. An hour passed, or maybe it was 3. Time had become a fluid thing, measured not in minutes but in the rhythm of their walking and the slow wheeling of the constellations above. Her throat was a desert. Her body ached with a deep, settled weariness. He stopped. He unslung a canteen from his shoulder. The sound of sloshing water was the most beautiful music she had ever heard. He drank, then held it out to her, his arm extended back without turning his body. She hesitated. Kindness was a language she had forgotten how to speak or to understand. Her hand trembled as she reached for it. Her fingers brushed against his. His skin was calloused and dry, like old leather. She drank. The water was cool and tasted of metal and earth. It was life. She drank until her throat eased, then drank some more. She handed it back to him, their fingers brushing again. It was the only contact they had shared, a spark of warmth in the vast, cold dark. He took the canteen and walked on. They arrived near midnight. The homestead was a dark shape crouched against the horizon, a smudge of deeper black against the star-dusted sky. A single structure, a small barn, and a tracery of fence lines disappearing into the night. It was an island of human effort in an ocean of wilderness. The place felt as quiet and solitary as the man who lived there. He led her not to the front door, but around to a pump near the back. He worked the handle, and after a few dry, groaning gasps, water gushed out, pooling in the basin below. He motioned for her to wash. The water was shockingly cold. It sluiced the layers of dust and grime from her face and hands, leaving her skin tingling and raw. Felt like shedding a skin. Inside, the house was one large room, bisected by shadows from a single lantern he lit on the table. The light was soft, yellow, and kind. It revealed a space that was spare and fiercely clean. A stone hearth, swept of ash. A sturdy table with 2 chairs. A bed in one corner, neatly made. There was a door on the far wall, closed tight. The air was still, heavy with a silence that was more than just an absence of sound. It was a presence, a history of unspoken things. He gestured to the hearth. A small cot lay against the wall beside it, a thin mattress and a single, folded blanket. "You can sleep there," he said. The words were simple, factual. He went to a cupboard and took out a heel of dark bread and a small wedge of cheese. He placed them on the table, then sat. He did not invite her to join him, but he did not begin to eat. He simply waited. She watched him for a long moment, his face cast in the warm, flickering light of the lantern. The shadows carved deep lines around his eyes and mouth. He looked tired down to his very bones. Slowly, she moved to the other chair and sat. The wood was smooth beneath her hands. She took a piece of the bread. It was dense and slightly stale, but it was the best thing she had ever tasted. They ate in silence, the only sounds the soft rasp of chewing and the gentle hiss of the lantern. When they were finished, he stood and banked the fire, laying a few fresh logs on the embers. He didn't look at her when he spoke again, his voice low and directed at the flames. "I don't lock doors. No one will bother you here." It was a promise, a contract written in the air between them. He retreated to his own bed in the corner, turning his back to the room before pulling off his boots. He lay down, fully clothed, and pulled a blanket over himself. Within minutes, the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing filled the small cabin. She remained at the table, wrapped in the quiet. The fire popped, sending a spray of orange sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind turned mean, rattling the window panes. But inside, there was a strange, fragile peace. For the first time in more years than she could count, she was warm, she was fed, she was safe. She looked at the man's still form across the room, a bulwark against the vast, hungry dark. She did not know his name. She did not know his story. But in the hollowed-out space where her own life used to be, a tiny, tentative seed of trust had been planted. She crept to the cot, pulled the rough blanket over her shoulders, and closed her eyes. Sleep did not come easily, but for the first time it did not feel like a surrender. Felt like a rest. The days that followed fell into a rhythm, as quiet and predictable as the rising and setting of the sun. Their lives became a shared silence, a dance of parallel tasks that rarely intersected, but were always aware of each other. He would rise before dawn, his movements quiet so as not to wake her. She would hear the soft scrape of his boots on the floorboards, the splash of water at the basin, the click of the door latch. When she woke, he would be gone, already out in the fields or mending a fence line at the far edge of the property. A bowl of oatmeal would be waiting for her on the table, still warm. This was how he spoke to her in the mornings. Her world became the four walls of the cabin and the small, wind-scoured yard around it. She learned the landscape of the room. The way a specific floorboard creaked near the hearth, the pattern of water stains on the ceiling, the way the morning light cut a perfect, dusty rectangle across the wooden floor. She began to impose her own order on the space. She swept the floors until they shone with a dull luster. She scrubbed the tabletop with sand and water, erasing years of grime. She washed their few dishes and stacked them neatly. These were not chores done out of obligation. They were acts of reclamation. She was scrubbing away the emptiness, filling the hollow house with her own quiet presence. He never acknowledged her work with words, but he would come in from the fields, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion, and his eyes would sweep the room. A slight, almost imperceptible softening would touch the hard line of his mouth. One evening, he came in to find she had mended a tear in his duster, her stitches small and neat. He ran his thumb over the repaired seam, his head bent. He said nothing. He didn't need to. One afternoon, while gathering kindling near the edge of the property, she found it. A small, low mound of earth, marked by a simple wooden cross that had been weathered to a silver gray. The wind had worn away any name that might have been carved there. Beside it was a second, much smaller mound. His wife and child. The hollow silence of the cabin now had a name. It was grief. She didn't touch the graves. Felt like trespassing on sacred, sorrowful ground. But the next day, she found a stubborn patch of purple wildflowers growing near the barn. She picked a small handful and, when he was out of sight, she placed them at the base of the wooden cross. It was a small gesture, a whisper of empathy in the vast, quiet land. When he came home that night, he was carrying a heavy woolen shawl, the color of moss. It was old but well cared for. He laid it on the foot of her cot without a word. It was his reply. Their communication became a tapestry woven from these unspoken threads. He would leave a bucket of fresh milk on the porch. She would use it to make a simple cheese. She would bake bread, and though her first few loaves were dense and hard enough to break a tooth, he ate every slice without complaint. One time, seeing him struggle with a dry, tough piece, a ghost of a smile touched her lips. "That loaf died in vain," she whispered, the words startling her own ears. He looked up, surprised not by the sentiment but by the sound of her voice. It was the first thing she had said to him beyond a single word. He chewed thoughtfully for a moment, then swallowed. A faint light of humor sparked in his tired eyes. "A little dry," he allowed. "You didn't complain about mine." A low voice rumbled back, so quiet she almost thought she'd imagined it. It was the closest they had come to a conversation. It was enough. The nights were the hardest. The darkness brought with it the memories she kept locked away during the day. One night, a dream clawed its way out of the past. The smell of whiskey, the sound of Brand's booming laugh, the feeling of ropes biting into her skin. She woke with a gasp, sitting bolt upright on her cot, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The room was dark, save for the faint, pulsing glow of the embers in the hearth. "Don't lock me in," she breathed into the darkness, the words torn from a place of old terror. A floorboard creaked from the other side of the room. He was awake. He didn't light the lantern. He didn't speak. He simply rose from his bed, a tall shadow in the gloom, and moved to the chair by the hearth. He sat down, his form a silent, solid presence between her and the door. He picked up a piece of wood and began to whittle, the soft scrape of his knife a steady, calming rhythm in the night. He sat there for hours. He didn't offer comfort or platitudes. He simply shared the darkness with her, his quiet vigil a promise that she was not alone, that the door would remain unlocked. She lay back down, pulling the moss-colored shawl around her. She watched the silhouette of his shoulders, the slow, patient movement of his hands, until the terror receded and the quiet rhythm of the knife lulled her back into a dreamless sleep. The next morning, she approached the closed door on the far wall. It was the one part of the house she had not touched, the one secret he kept locked away. She ran her fingers over the cool, smooth wood. It felt different from the rest of the cabin, untouched by time or grief. He came to stand behind her, his presence a warm weight at her back. She didn't turn. "Why did you take me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The question had been sitting on her tongue for weeks. He was silent for a long time. The only sound was the wind sighing around the corners of the house. "My wife, Mary," he began, his voice rough with disuse. "She was kind. She wouldn't have left you there," he paused. The work was too much for one person. It was two answers. One for his dead wife's memory, one for the practical world. Both were true. But she heard the third answer, the one he didn't say. He was lonely. The silence in this house was as heavy for him as it was for her. He reached past her and his hand rested on the latch of the closed door. This was her room, he said. He didn't open it. Not yet. But by speaking its name, he had unlocked something far more important. He had shared the geography of his grief with her. And in doing so, he had given her a piece of his own story, a trust more profound than any blanket or bowl of oatmeal. The thaw was no longer slow. It was a current, moving beneath the frozen surface of their lives, gaining strength. The peace they had built was as fragile as a pane of frost on a winter window. They both knew it. The world outside the small circle of their homestead had not forgotten them, and one afternoon, it came calling. It began not with a sound, but with a feeling. A change in the air. Elias, who had been splitting wood near the barn, stopped mid-swing, his axe held aloft. He stood perfectly still, his head tilted, tasting the wind. She, who was hanging washed linens on a line, felt it too, a prickling on her skin, a sudden tension in the vast, open silence. She followed his gaze to the horizon. First it was nothing, just the endless, rolling brown of the plains. Then she saw it, a faint plume of dust, small and insignificant against the enormous sky, but growing steadily larger. It was not the lazy dust of a lone rider or a farmer's wagon. It was the purposeful, aggressive cloud of several horses moving fast. Elias lowered his axe slowly. His face, which had begun to lose some of its harsh, weary lines, settled back into a mask of grim resolve. He looked at her, his eyes dark with a message she understood instantly. "Go inside." She didn't hesitate. She gathered the damp linens into her arms and hurried into the cabin, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She latched the door, a gesture that felt both futile and necessary. She went to the window, peering through a small gap in the curtains. The riders grew from smudges to distinct shapes. 3 of them. The man in the lead, even from a distance, was unmistakable. The arrogant slump of his shoulders, the way he sat his horse as if it were a throne. It was Brand. Elias did not go inside. He stood his ground in the middle of the yard, the axe held loosely in one hand, its blade glinting in the hard afternoon sun. He was a solitary, unmovable figure, rooted to the land he had carved out of the wilderness. Brand and his men reined in their horses a few yards from him, kicking up a storm of dust that momentarily obscured them. The horses were lathered, their sides heaving. Brand's face was flushed with drink and a smug certainty. He surveyed the small, tidy homestead with a contemptuous sneer. "Well, well," he boomed, his voice slicing through the quiet air. "Looks like my little Penny has landed on her feet. You've put some work into her. I'll give you that." Elias said nothing. His silence was a wall. Brand dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft earth. He swaggered forward, his 2 companions remaining on their horses, their hands resting on the pommels of their saddles. They were not men who worked the land. They were men who took from it. "I've come to collect my property, friend," Brand said, stopping a few feet from Elias. "The deal was a lease. You had your use of her. Now I have a buyer down in the territory who pays top dollar for quiet ones. There was no lease, Elias said. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, carried the weight of cold fact. It was a sale. Brand laughed. A short, ugly sound. A sale? For that handful of coin? That was a deposit. A courtesy. I'm a businessman. Now, you fetch her out here before my patience wears thin. She is not property, Elias stated, his grip tightening slightly on the axe handle. And she is not yours. Inside the cabin, she watched, her breath caught in her throat. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides, her knuckles white. The old fear, the familiar paralysis, was a cold tide rising in her veins. She felt the phantom bite of the rope on her wrists. The world was shrinking back down to the size of that hitching post. Brand's face darkened. He took another step forward, invading Elias's space. I have a bill of sale, legal and binding. You're harboring stolen goods. Now I'm gonna walk into that little shack of yours and take what belongs to me. You can either step aside, or my friends and I can move you. He made to push past Elias. It was the moment the world fractured. Elias didn't swing the axe. He moved with a speed that belied his weariness, shifting his body to block Brand's path. The head of the axe coming up to rest squarely in the center of Brand's chest. It was not a threat of violence. It was a statement of absolute finality. A line had been drawn. You will not enter this house, Elias said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. You will get on your horse, and you will leave my land. But it was the sound of the cabin door flying open that made all three men turn. She stood there, framed in the doorway, her thin frame trembling but her eyes blazing with a light Brand had never seen before. The shawl Elias had given her was wrapped around her shoulders like armor. Her fear was still there, a wild animal in her chest, but for the first time, something else stood beside it. Rage. A deep, pure rage for this man who had tried to erase her, and a fierce, protective loyalty to the man who had given her a place to exist. Brand's eyes lit up with a cruel victory. Ah, there she is. See? She wants to come home. She took a step out of the house, then another, onto the land she had swept and tended. Her eyes never left Brand's. She saw him for what he was. A small, loud man, his power built entirely on the fear of others. No, she said. The word was thin, rusty from disuse, but it cut through the air with the clarity of a bell. Brand's smirk faltered. He looked at her as if she were a dog that had just spoken. She took another step, her bare feet pressing into the familiar earth. She raised her hand, and in it, she held the heavy iron skillet from the hearth. She didn't brandish it like a weapon. She held it like a shield, a symbol of the home she was now defending. This is my home, she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. You are not welcome here. The defiance, coming from this silent, broken creature he thought he owned, was more shocking to Brand than any axe. It stripped him of his power. He looked from her defiant face to Elias's immovable calm, and for the first time, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. His companions on their horses shifted uneasily. This was not the simple collection they had signed up for. Just then, another figure appeared, coming over the rise from the neighboring homestead. It was their neighbor, a farmer named Silas, drawn by the sound of the confrontation. He carried a shotgun held loosely at his side. He didn't say a word. He just walked over and stood a few paces behind Elias, a silent, damning witness. Brand looked at the three of them. The quiet man with the axe, the woman with the skillet who had found her voice, and the neighbor with the shotgun. He was outnumbered, not by force, but by a quiet, unyielding unity. His bluff had been called. The land itself seemed to stand with them. He backed away, his face a mask of thwarted rage and humiliation. You'll regret this, he snarled, the threat sounding hollow and childish. Both of you. He stumbled back to his horse, mounted clumsily, and without another look, he spurred the animal into a gallop, his men scrambling to follow. They rode away, their dust cloud a frantic, final insult against the calm sky. Silence descended once more upon the homestead. It was a different kind of silence now. Not empty, but full. Full of the echoes of her voice, the weight of his stance, the solidarity of a neighbor. The air thrummed with it. Elias slowly lowered the axe. His shoulders, which had been rigid with tension, slumped in relief. He turned to her. His eyes met hers, and in their depths, she saw a universe of things he would never say. Pride, relief, a raw, staggering gratitude. She looked down at the skillet in her hand, as if surprised to see it there. Her arm began to tremble, the adrenaline draining away, leaving a profound exhaustion in its wake. The skillet slipped from her fingers, clattering into the dust. "I was scared," she whispered, the confession a fragile offering in the quiet air. He took a step toward her, then another, until he was standing right in front of her. "I know," he said, his voice rough with emotion. He reached out, not to touch her face or her shoulder, but to gently take her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around her small, trembling ones. "You didn't run." He held her hand for a long moment, his grip firm and steady, grounding her. It was an anchor in the swirling aftermath of the storm. It was an acknowledgement. It was a promise. In the dusty yard of their small, defiant home, they were no longer two separate, broken people. They were a fortress. That night, the fire in the hearth seemed to burn brighter, warmer. The confrontation had burned away the last of the ghosts that haunted the corners of the cabin. They sat at the table, a shared meal of bread and cheese between them. The comfortable silence returned, but fundamentally changed. It was no longer a silence of caution, but of deep, abiding peace. Elias looked at her across the flickering candlelight, his gaze steady and clear. The shadows were gone from his eyes, replaced by a soft, questioning light. "They never used your name," he said. It was a statement, not a question. "I don't know what to call you." She looked down at her hands, resting on the smooth wood of the table. For so long, she had been a creature without a name, an object defined by others. Girl, penny, property. The name she was born with felt like a skin she had shed seasons ago, belonging to a person she no longer was. Here, in this quiet cabin, with this quiet man, she had been reborn into someone new. She thought for a moment, then looked up at him. "Lena," she said. The name felt new in her mouth, clean and strong. It was her own choice, an act of self-creation. "Lena," he repeated, testing the sound of it. The name settled in the small room, fitting perfectly into the space. A smile, the first true smile she had ever seen from him, touched his lips. It transformed his face, erasing the last traces of winter from his features. "It's a good name." The giving of her name was the final stone laid in the foundation of their new life. The next morning, Elias did something he hadn't done since she arrived. He walked to the closed door of his wife's room and opened it. He stood on the threshold for a long time, then he turned to Lena. "Will you help me?" he asked. Together they entered the room. It was not a shrine, but a space frozen in time, dust motes dancing in the single shaft of light from a boarded window. They worked all day, a quiet, synchronized team. They packed Mary's clothes into a wooden chest. They took down the faded curtains. Elias pried the boards from the window, and for the first time in years, sunlight and fresh air flooded the small room, chasing out the stale air of grief. It was not an act of erasure, but one of honor. They were making space. They were letting the house breathe again. That evening, he took the old, splintered wooden cross from the graves of his wife and child. He spent hours by the fire, carefully sanding it smooth, carving their names into the wood with his knife. Mary, Samuel. Then, below them, with a slow, deliberate hand, he carved a new word: family. The next day, he set it back in the earth, a testament not just to what was lost, but to what had been found. The seasons turned. The harsh sun of summer softened into the golden light of autumn. The wind carried the smell of rain instead of dust. Lena planted a small garden near the house, and green shoots pushed their way through the stubborn soil. Elias started to hum sometimes as he worked, tuneless melodies that spoke of a heart slowly mending. Their life was not one of grand passions or loud declarations. It was built of smaller, sturdier things. The shared warmth of the fire on a cold night, the smell of baking bread filling the cabin, the way he would watch her as she tended her garden, a look of quiet wonder on his face, the way she would leave a cup of hot coffee on the porch railing for him in the mornings. They were stitching their lives together with threads of unspoken kindness, creating a tapestry strong enough to withstand any storm. The final image of their story isn't a grand finale. There is no wedding, no public celebration. It is a quiet evening in late fall. Snow is just beginning to dust the plains, a fine, white powder that glitters under a rising moon. They sit together on the small porch he built, wrapped in thick blankets, watching the world turn white. The house behind them is warm, its windows glowing with a soft, yellow light. It is no longer a hollow shelter, but a home. It breathes with the slow, steady rhythm of their shared life. Lena rests her head against his shoulder, a simple, comfortable gesture. He puts his arm around her, holding her close. They don't speak. They don't need to. In the vast, silent wilderness, under a sky full of stars, two broken souls had found each other in the wreckage and had built a sanctuary, not of wood and stone, but of trust and kindness and a quiet, resilient love. Fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. This story, you see, it ain't just about rescue. It's about the quiet, stubborn power of being seen. We all walk through this world carrying our own invisible burdens, our own silent griefs. We build walls inside ourselves, room by room, until we forget what the sun feels like. We forget our own names, and we think that's just how it has to be. But sometimes, if you're very lucky, someone comes along who doesn't try to break down your walls. They just sit with you in the dark. They offer you a canteen of water on a long, dusty road. They see the person you are behind the one the world has tried to make you. They give you a place where your own name, spoken in your own voice, is enough. So here's your naming. It's a reminder that sanctuary isn't always a place. Sometimes it's a person. It's the quiet space between two people who have decided that their broken pieces fit together just right. And if you're brave enough to sweep out the dust, and to let in the light, you might just find that the life you build from the ashes is stronger and more beautiful than the one you ever imagined before the fire. You might just find a home,